So first, let me say a heartfelt thank you to Attorney General Madrid, not just for that very generous introduction, but for being one of the most important professional advisors, partners, and iconic models for me in my career as a lawyer. It has been one of the great privileges of my professional career that I've had the opportunity to be mentored by a number of extraordinarily accomplished Latino and Latina lawyers. I note that many of them are women who have been my most important mentors, and I certainly consider Patricia Madrid one of those whom I've had the great privilege to partner with and work with. So thank you for all that you have done and continue to do in leading not just New Mexico, but the entire country, Patsy. And I do want to thank Mickey Ibarra, first of all, for recognizing me here this afternoon. And I will say publicly, Mickey, you were right. I had my doubts about this California-born, LA residing his entire life Latino lawyer being honored in Albuquerque, and I hesitated. But as the governor said, you can't ultimately say no to Mickey, so I did have to say yes, and I want to say now, Mickey, you were right. You were right. How special it is to be here in front of this crowd in Albuquerque makes this recognition even more of an honor and delight. And that is not just because, as you heard, my current position was granted me here in New Mexico by the MALDEF Board of Directors, that at the time included not just Patricia Madrid as our illustrious chair, but two others who are here. Mickey Ibarra was on the MALDEF board at the time, and Maria Estela de Rios, whom you heard from earlier, was on the MALDEF board at the time. And I cherish every one of their votes because it was a split vote. It was not unanimous, so every vote was important when I was selected and given the honor of serving as president and general counsel of MALDEF. For those who may not be familiar with MALDEF, and I hope that that is a very small number of you, we are a now 56-year-old national legal civil rights organization whose mission is to promote the civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States. We pursue that mission primarily in the courts, and thank you, Governor Luján Grisham, for recognizing the partnership that should be the result of good civil rights litigation. The best leaders, and you are one of them, recognize the roles that we each play and how they can come together, even sometimes out of searing circumstances, to lead to long-term partnerships for the betterment of all of us. But MALDEF does its work primarily in the courts, but also through policy advocacy and through community education. And our work, now 56 years in, is, as you all know, as challenging today as it ever has been. When we marked our 50th anniversary, we welcomed, as we always do, back two of our surviving premier leaders, Vilma Martinez and Antonio Hernandez, and discussed with them how they perceive today in comparison to what they knew about the Latino situation in 1968 when MALDEF was founded. And they both acknowledged, together with numerous other leaders in MALDEF's history, that our challenge today, despite the great progress achieved by MALDEF and the broader Latino community, our challenge today is as bad, is as great as it was in 1968. Now that is in part because of the course of the growth of the Latino community, a growth that is perceived even now by too many as a threat to the country rather than as the extraordinary asset and foundation upon which to build our collective national future. But it has been my great honor for 15 years to lead MALDEF in facing that ongoing and important challenge. Indeed, I have spent 27 years of my now 33-year legal career at MALDEF as an attorney, staff attorney, regional counsel, vice president of litigation, and ultimately, after 4 years with Mayor Villaraigosa, as president and general counsel. Now, I know from that terrific book that Mickey talked about earlier that others who have received this tremendous honor have talked about their very personal journeys to where they are today. So I have to talk in a more personal way than I often do. And Mickey's right about the location, but Mickey's only given me 20 minutes. And you all know 20 minutes public speaking for an attorney is like a minute. So I'm going to do my best not to threaten Mickey's record of always ending on time. But I do want to just spend a few minutes telling some stories about my journey. But I begin by acknowledging that the first Latino leaders with influence in my life were, of course, my parents, Edward Saenz and Margarita Parada, both of whom achieved tremendous progress, success, particularly, I would say, somewhat immodestly, as parents to two young Latinos, then young, not anymore, look the gray hair, but my brother and me. Their examples of leadership were, of course, as powerful as what they said to my brother James and me at the dinner table. But I will say, the two messages directly delivered at the dinner table to both of us that I most recall were, one, the singular importance of education and educational achievement. This despite the fact that neither of my parents were able to go on to college in their youth. My father achieved his Associate of Arts degree from the local community college through night school when I was 5. And then it was my mother's turn, and she achieved her AA from the same local community college when I was 15. But despite that lack of formal college education in their early years, they conveyed to both my brother and me the clear, not just expectation, absolute mandate that we would go on to 4-year universities and would achieve what was necessary to get there. But the other clear and resounding message, as often as it was delivered, was that we were to always acknowledge and be proud of the fact that we were Americans of Mexican descent. Those messages continue, of course, to govern my life and that of my brother. I want to pause to say how extraordinarily proud I am of my brother, a year older than me. We shared a room for 16 plus years, who became a leader in his own right, graduating from West Point, serving for 30 years in the US Army, retiring as a colonel, and now working as a Biden administration appointee in the Department of Defense. But I want to spend just a few moments telling stories about two things. One, Latino identity in my life, and second, confronting authority and its importance in my life. I want to begin with the latter. Again, my parents, and later in life, my brother, were examples to me of how important it was to stand up and advocate. You heard at the beginning of that video the most important story of when my mother stood up to a white, retiring, literally on the cusp of retirement. I think that may have been one of his last meetings, was having to discuss with my parents and me my placement in courses in high school. Now, to give you just a little more background, I will acknowledge something that will surprise no one who knows me, but as a child, I was a nerd. And successful in school because I listened and paid attention, as was expected of me. So the counselor was meeting with my parents and me as I was skipping 8th grade and going from 7th grade to high school, and placing me in courses for that transition. So he had in front of him test scores and the recommendations of my teachers, who basically said, we can teach him nothing more in 8th grade. He needs to either, and they gave this choice to my parents, who in turn made the choice, or rather imposed the choice on me, to decide between their two options. One of which was to go to the best elementary school in the small district we were in, which is in the neighboring city of Monterey Park, California, and perhaps not coincidentally, given what we see happening throughout the country, it was an overwhelmingly Asian elementary school in student population. I could either do that or go straight to high school. And not coincidentally, that meant being in the exact same class as my brother, who was a year older than me. Now, I made that choice to go with my brother to high school, and we were meeting with this counselor, had the teacher's recommendations, very strong, had the test scores, and still said, looking, as I said, at my parents, at the fact that I was coming from the most Latino elementary school in the district, and said, let's enroll him in the mid-level algebra course. Mind you, that course didn't put you on a route to getting calculus as a 12th grader. The only way you got to calculus was in the higher level algebra course. And he said, let's put him in the middle level algebra course, see how he does. Does well enough, we can move him up. And I and my father were ready to accept that judgment of the authority figure, this retiring white counselor. It was only my mother who gathered the temerity and the wisdom to stand up and say, no, I will not leave your office until you consent to enrolling my son in the highest level algebra course at high school. Now, I think often about that experience because I know there are so many Latino students who don't have that advocate, who should have that advocate, who need that advocate to achieve equity in the educational experience. But there were other experiences with confronting authority. I remember the very first was as a 6th grader and being out at recess in my elementary school, playing with my friends, and there was a recess aide who was a white woman who told my friends on that particular morning that they could not speak Spanish on the playground. Never happened before, never happened since in my experience, but it happened that day. And to this day, I don't know where I came up with the audacity to tell her that she was wrong. That you cannot tell them, my friends, that they cannot speak Spanish on the playground. Now, the important thing here is, instead of dragging me to the principal's office, as I fully expected would happen, that recess aide instead engaged me in discussion and dialogue about the issue. So my first experience confronting authority did not result in the tremendous consequences that so many others have faced and continue to face as adults, very dangerous consequences in confronting authority. But that experience was followed by others, where I learned that confronting authority often resulted in good results, not punishment. I recall, as a senior in college, in order to apply for a prestigious scholarship that I was seeking, you had to have the recommendation of your residential college dean. Now, without going into details, let's just say my relationship with my residential college dean was not good. She believed that I had fraudulently transferred into her college through my connection to a Latina assistant dean of the entire college who was in charge of transfers. We had not a productive relationship, but I had to meet with her. I met with her, she looked at my resume, she looked at me, and she was a Russian emigre. And the first thing she said to me was, I don't understand why Latino immigrants are treated differently from immigrants from other countries like Russia. Why are Latino immigrants, Latinos, given affirmative action and not others? Now, as a student trying to get a letter of recommendation necessary for this fellowship, I, as nicely as I could, explained to her how the Latino experience was dramatically different from that of European immigrant groups, even though they may have faced discrimination upon arrival and in the years thereafter, and got the recommendation that I needed. But I also passed this on to a Chicano history professor who was a friend and mentor, and thinking he was doing me a favor, he confronted that residential college dean, who immediately summoned me to her office to discuss this. And true to the script, she stood up in the middle of the meeting and said, now you've accused me of being a racist in power. And I explained as calmly as I could, and despite great anxiety and nervousness, that no, I had explained to a mentor professor that she had some racial ignorance, which is different from being a racist. And despite that difficult confrontation, there were no further punishment or consequences. Final example was in law school as a first year. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. And there was a movement across the country in law schools to demand greater diversity. And so at Yale Law School, all of the minority law student associations had a strike day for diversity. And I was a part of the Latino Law Students Association presentation. And in my presentation, I noted that a prominent Yale law professor had, in the aftermath of the Bakke decision in 1978, penned a New York Times op-ed that actually advocated for dropping Latinos from affirmative action consideration while leaving it for blacks and Native Americans. I put that out there. Later in the day, that prominent Yale Law School professor, who was then the dean, did what progressive deans were supposed to do: show up at the diversity strike and make your own supportive comments. I should have, but couldn't resist after he did that, standing up and identifying him. I had not identified him by name before, identifying him by name as the professor who had penned that op-ed advocating for dumping Latinos from affirmative action consideration. But again, the key lesson here was he didn't punish me. He did tell my friend who was moderating the discussion that he wanted to see me immediately after it was over. But he walked me to his office offered me a glass of sherry. That's what he did, this particular dean, to everybody. Offered me a glass of sherry and explained that he had long ago disavowed that op-ed because the Latino law students of the day had confronted him. He explained that the only reason he had written it is because his experience with the Latino community came from his college roommate being the son of the governor of Puerto Rico. I kept to myself how astounded I was that he would write a New York Times op-ed based on an experience with his roommate being the governor, son of the governor of Puerto Rico, but we parted in good company. And indeed, he would never have noticed me but for that experience. And several weeks later, when he was belatedly grading exams from his course in the first semester, he called me on a Saturday. He would never have done that had I not confronted him to talk about my exam. But my point is, in my personal experience, confronting authority has resulted in good things, not punishment, or what so many others have experienced, violence, threats, and real endangerment. And that's a part of what I now want to talk about, Latino identity. As I said, from a very early age, I was taught to be proud being an American of Mexican descent. But I had several experiences where folks inside and outside the Latino community declined to recognize me or failed to recognize me as a Latino. First memory was as a 9 or 10-year-old in a pull-out program that took certain students from my elementary school, transported us to another elementary school, and our program would occur in the cafeteria at that school, often in the presence of the cafeteria workers on their morning break. I remember to this day, one day, feeling like the cafeteria workers were staring at me. You know, you have that sense somebody's staring at you, you don't know why. So anyway, they finished their conversation. As they were walking out, one of them came to me, a Latina, and said, "We've been wondering what your background is. Are you Italian or something?" I explained to her that I was an American of Mexican descent and moved on. A few years later, though, one of my classmates, in a wrinkle that to this day surprises me and puzzles me, it was a classmate who had been tutored by my mother as an instructional aide in Spanish. But we were talking as we were working behind the scenes as stage crew for the 8th grade spring musical, and he says to me, "We don't really know who you are. What is your background? Are you French or something?" Again, he had been tutored by my own mother in Spanish earlier in his career. But finally, as a sophomore at Yale, a very good friend, my sophomore year roommate, said to me one day that I did not look like a Mexican to him. And at that point, it hit me hard. I became very distraught about that at that point. And I will tell you, it began a thought in my mind about passing as white. And I literally considered, for quite some time in the back of my head, a plan by which I would pass as white for my career. But it was all leading up to the plan of achieving great success, maybe even a life tenure position on the US Supreme Court, and at that point, doing the big reveal and saying, "You all thought I was a white lawyer, but in fact, you just put a Mexican American on the Supreme Court." Now that was just a plan that went nowhere. And it went nowhere because I realized, in part from experiencing or reading passing literature from other communities, that I probably couldn't stomach it. Having to put up with what I already sometimes have to put up with, people telling racist Mexican jokes in your presence because they don't think you're from that community. But if I was passing, I couldn't confront them, as I currently have the ability to do, and say to them, yeah, I'm one, so leave it there. So I couldn't internally stomach it, that passing plan, and I realized that it would be a betrayal, not just of my parents, but of their parents and their journeys to the United States, or as part of the United States, to secure a better future, not just for their children, but for the Latino community writ large. So I abandoned that plan and went on, of course, to leadership of the chapter of MECHA at Yale, leadership in minority recruiting, leadership in law school of the Latino Law Students Association, and to a now 27-year career at MALDEF and a 33-year career as an advocate for civil rights for the Latino community. But now I have the arrogance and audacity to try to take these lessons from my personal experience and apply them to our community writ large. And here's what I have to say, and I know many of you in the room will agree, but I am concerned that our Latino community nationally is flirting with passing far, far too much. And what passing in this context means is not vocally and constantly correcting those who would fail to see us as what we are. A racialized group present in this country over decades and decades, and still continuing to experience ongoing, systematic, nationwide racial prejudice and oppression. Passing for the Latino community means instead tacitly accepting those on the right who would characterize us as simply another European immigrant ethnic group whose problems with discrimination will diminish over generations, analogizing us to the Irish, the Germans, the Italians. When we tacitly accept that, we are passing. Passing also means believing and acting on an assumption that if we assimilate enough, we will achieve equality. Passing means accepting even tacitly that somehow our role as leaders in equality and civil rights is less than that of other minority communities. This kind of passing is what I fear we in the Latino community nationally spend too much time fascinated with and flirting with that as a path to success. My personal experience tells me that the greater, more successful path involves confronting authority figures when they seek to diminish our importance, when they seek to pervert our experience, when they seek to classify us as white immigrants, along with so many others. Now, admittedly, my experience with confronting authority is not shared by others who faced and continue to face real danger. But I continue to believe that the path of confrontation, done politely, done though persistently, and in a united fashion, is the right path for our community. Now, this is particularly important in this day and age when we have been, for over 21 years, the largest racial minority group in the United States. This is particularly important today when Latinos are on the cusp of being, in percentage terms, the largest minority group in the entire history of the United States. That is to say, that at our country's beginnings, demographic estimates say that 19% of the population was African American. Then, of course, the vast, vast majority unjustly enslaved, but 19% of the population. That's where we are today. We are about then to become, in percentage terms, the largest minority group in the entire history of the United States. We are on the cusp of becoming, in population terms, larger than the combined populations of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans in this country. Now that is an indication of our leadership obligation. So this is the time, if our community ever had a big reveal in mind, now is the time for the big reveal that we will no longer flirt with passing, that we will no longer accept diminution of our importance, our responsibility, our status as racial minorities in the lead for civil rights and equality for the first time to be achieved true to the principles of our nation's founding. So I hope you all will agree, and perhaps from your own experiences, convey to others how important it is that we abandon a path of flirting with passing and embark on our necessary and imposed, our ready leadership of our country. You heard earlier, and I agree, and I know from my personal and family experience, we are a community of great strength, of great resilience, of great courage. And our ability to confront authority successfully is unmatched by any other community. So I hope from your own experiences with identity, with confrontation, you will join me in insisting that our community stop seeking or agreeing to pass and instead embark on our necessary leadership in this next phase of our country's ongoing development. Thank you again to the Latino Leaders Network. Thank you again to all of you for being here this afternoon.
Tom Saenz, on behalf of the Latino Leaders Network, we are pleased to present our Eagle Leadership Award for your outstanding service to our nation and our community as the Latino legal voice for civil rights in America.